I want to take you back to a specific moment in time. I want to go back to that moment when you decided to be a music educator. Can you really sit in that memory with me for just a moment? I want you to imagine where you were, who you were with, what it sounded like, what it looked like. You can even close your eyes if that helps you to really sit in that memory. And when you're in that memory with me, let me know just like this. That moment when you decided to be a music educator. What is the one word you would use to sum up that moment? Turn to your neighbor and tell them. What's the one word that sums up when you decided to be a music educator? I heard crazy. All right, and so I want to know those words too. So would you just shout out to me, what's the word that sums up that moment for you? Just shout it out.
Jesus.
Jesus. Joy. Exciting? Exciting? Passion. Quiet. I heard crazy also earlier. Scary. For me, when I think about the moment when I decided to be a music educator, and as you were sitting in that moment, I went back to that moment as well, I actually think of the word electricity, this electric feeling that I now know is probably just a joyful feeling, because I felt it in multiple different places, but I would say it feels like electricity. So if you don't mind, I want to take you back to my moment when I decided to be a music educator. Let's go all the way back to May of 2010. I was in Venezuela on a study abroad trip. I had just graduated from my undergraduate degree at James Madison University, go Dukes, and I was studying El Sistema and also volunteering and teaching. Is anyone familiar with the program El Sistema? A few folks. In case you're not already familiar with El Sistema, it is a social change through music program that was developed in Venezuela, the idea being that we can use music as a vehicle to change our communities. And since then, it has spread all over the world, but in 2010, it was just becoming this like worldwide sensation. In fact, it was just coming to the United States in 2010. Now we have El Sistema-inspired community music programs all over the country. Here in the DMV, we have Orchids in Baltimore. In Virginia, we have Soundscapes. If we go a little up further in Philadelphia, we have Play on Philly, and many all over the country. So in 2010 in Venezuela, when I was on that study abroad trip, we were learning about the administrative and operational things of the program, all different regions of Venezuela. And I was teaching, rehearsing, working with the students. In fact, that's actually a picture of baby teacher Ashley way back in 2010 when I was leading one of those rehearsals. And it may have been this rehearsal or another, but I remember that electric feeling so clearly. In fact, I feel it right now. Whenever I get a chance to speak in front of folks, I still feel this joy, this electricity. Now, it actually was not the first time I had felt that electricity. In fact, I had first felt that electricity when I was 15, and I decided that I was going to be the principal flutist of a major symphony orchestra. And as a goal-oriented overachiever, I made a goal, I created a plan, and I had been executing that plan, thank you so much, since I was 15. So I was about 22, I guess, in this moment. Along the way, I kind of fell into teaching part-time, supporting a band and orchestra teacher at a middle school down in Harrisonburg where I was studying. And I felt that electricity, but in a different way. It was something about working with kids and young people and making music with them, but also helping them figure out stuff that led me to have this electricity. But it was not part of the plan to be a music teacher, right? I'm goal-oriented, I had my plan, so I ignored it. But when I was in Venezuela for that month, I could not ignore that electricity that I felt every day that I got to be with those students, with those communities. And so I decided, I'm gonna go ahead and be a music teacher. And in the fall of 2010, that's where I went. I started teaching here in the DMV. I taught both in DC, I taught in Northern Virginia. Nobody was more excited than me to be a music teacher because I just knew I was gonna get to sit in that electricity every single day. I couldn't wait to share the joy of music making with my kids. However, While I was super excited, enthusiastic, full of joy, on a good day, I would say my students maybe were bored, apathetic, disinterested, but on a bad day, I would say my classroom felt like it was on fire. I just could not get my students to listen to what I had to say. I couldn't get them to stop fighting with each other, with me. Basically, imagine all the things that could go wrong in an elementary general music classroom. That's what I was doing. And those things were probably happening. I remember actually a particular day with one of my 5th grade groups that rocked me, and I still think about this core memory. Everything was going wrong, and it had been going wrong, right? I was working so hard to figure out how to get my students to be as enthusiastic as I was, right? So what does a goal-oriented overachiever do? Well, they have a plan and they execute the plan. So I was coming to school early every single day to set up my classroom for whatever cool thing Google had told me was the thing to get kids excited. I was staying late after school every day talking to teachers, trying to figure out what I could be doing. I read every single book on classroom management and engagement. I was taking courses, observing my mentor teacher, doing all of the things. And in this day, when literally everything was going wrong, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do next. So I talked with my mentor teacher, who also just happened to be the other music teacher at my school. We were part of the team of the music educators at my elementary school. And I was telling her about all the things that were going wrong. And she stopped me and she said, you know, Ashley, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Have you heard that phrase before? You catch more flies with honey? And remember, I had been working my booty off so hard every morning, every night, on the weekends, sacrificing time with my family, my friends. So I pushed back. I remember saying to her, Gwen, what do you mean I catch more flies with honey? I come to school every day ready to give my students a blank slate. I'm giving them the respect that I want them to give me, even when they're not showing me any respect. What do you mean I catch more flies with honey than vinegar? She very lovingly said to me, you know, Ashley, everything you've shared is about what you want to do and how you know how they're going to be excited. But have you asked them like what they're interested in, how they want to learn, and what they want to do? That was really hard feedback. Not only because of how hard I was working and realizing that I was running so fast like a hamster on a wheel, but literally going nowhere because I had missed the most important thing, and to get that feedback from someone who I admired and respected so much, my ego definitely got the best of me in that moment. I'm not ashamed to admit that it took me a couple of weeks to actually sit in the feedback that she gave me, but when I was able to really sit there, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to do what I was doing, like a hamster on the wheel, which was clearly not working. In fact, research tells us that most teachers don't make it past 5 years in the classroom. And in this moment, I had been teaching for about 3.5. I was clearly on the path to burnout and not making it. So I realized that I didn't have anything to lose to try something different. So that's what I did. I started asking my students questions like, well, what do you do for fun? And what's your family like? What do you do at home? What do you like to learn? What kind of music do you enjoy? I asked them some hard questions too. I asked them questions like, how can I be a better teacher for you? You have to have thick skin to ask young kids questions like that. But I realized that I was more committed to their success than my ego, so I leaned in, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when what they were suggesting I knew would be off the wall and maybe not work. But learning is messy, and it's supposed to be. So I leaned into the messiness, and I learned a couple of things. I learned that, first of all, the more I leaned into listening to what they were telling me, more so than what I thought, my preconceived notions, I realized that actually my students were pretty dope. They were brilliant, they were inquisitive, they were actually excited about learning when I didn't make it all about me. I also learned that when I really sought to understand them, not just know who they were, the labels, the IEPs, the 504s, but really understand who they were, we could really connect on a level that it felt like we were partners on this instructional journey in my music classroom. When I stopped focusing on getting them to do all the notes correctly and get my choir to perform perfectly on our concert, I learned that teaching music isn't really about teaching music. It's about who my students become because we're learning music together. And so I took all of those things and I have used the learnings that I got from my students because of all the courses and mini degrees and overachiever, right? All the things that I've done to this day, the only reason I'm able to do the work that I do now is because of the lessons that I learned from my students. And so the wonderful work I get to do now, as Josh shared, all over the country, is the proud founder of A. Cuthbertson Consulting. We're an educational consulting firm, and we work with fine arts teams all over the country to help their teachers be able to meet the diverse and ever-evolving needs of our learners today. And the wonderful things about what I get to do, which I know is a privilege, is that I remember baby teacher Ashley in 2010, 2011, who was so full of joy and enthusiasm, but was missing the mark. And I remember myself, because I see myself in so many of the teachers that I have the honor to work with and to support that have everything going for them, but just need the tools to be able to do so. For me, the key I found, it wasn't in all of the wonderful music techniques that I knew I could teach. The key really was when I was able to understand my students at a level that allowed me to make the learning effective to them by connecting to who they were, the pieces of who they were. Now, back then, I didn't know that there was a name for this, but I now know that the more I leaned into a culturally responsive approach to teaching, that really was the key for me, and it has been the key for the teachers that I have the privilege to work with and to support all over the country. Today, like I shared with you, I get to do this wonderful work, but I have not forgotten where I started. I haven't forgotten that electricity and that joy that I actually feel right now every time I get the ability to share, but really to connect with other people, to really understand how we can shift the trajectory of what music has been to what we know that it can be, something that really allows it to be a vehicle for all of our learners. So I really figured out that we don't have to chase after this joy, right? This feeling of electricity. I didn't need to chase it. But instead, when I use a culturally responsive approach to teaching and learning, which requires me to slow down, not be so goal-oriented and focus on the plan, but really to lean into the people, the learners I'm working with, that's where I was able to find that joy again after the classroom on fire period of my teaching career, but also allowed my students to have joy in the work that we were doing together. So I would love for us to have a conversation this morning about what it can look like when we lean into this culturally responsive approach to be able to foster joy for ourselves as teachers and the instructional leaders in our programs, as well as for our students. Is that okay that we talk a little bit about that? I mean, we don't have to. Okay, good. Just making sure. Awesome. All right, so first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here and welcoming Josh. Thank you so much for having me as your keynote speaker. I'm so excited to be able to share with you all a little bit more about my journey, but give you some strategies for how you can center joy for yourself. I talked a lot about myself already, and I'll share a few more of my stories and lessons along the way, but I would love to know a little bit more about the folks that I'm going to be in conversation with this morning. So when you hear something that resonates with who you are, feel free to give me a shout or a wave, or you can stand up. If you don't know already, I like a little bit of talk back, so don't feel like you need to sit there quietly in your seat. So I'm curious, who are teachers or educators in their first through fifth year of teaching? Awesome. Do we have any first-year teachers? No first-year teachers? Okay, awesome. A first-year teacher? All right, congratulations. All right. Halfway through, you got it, you got it. Do we have any teachers in years 6 through 10? A few? Okay, awesome. What about years 11 through, let's say, 19? Oh, okay, awesome. What about 20 plus? Okay, let me break it down. What about 25 plus? 30 plus? 33 plus? 34? 35, 36, 39, 40, 45, 41, 42. Somewhere in there. Okay, awesome. Sharon wins the work for most years teaching. Wow, that's amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know Josh asked this question earlier, but I was here last year at the DCMEA conference. We had a great time. Who else was here last year at the conference? Well, good to see you all again. And then raise your hand if this is your first time at the DCMEA conference. Awesome. You're in for a treat. This is a really great community of teachers. All right, so I shared with you earlier that when I started teaching, nobody was more excited than me to have my own classroom and to be able to feel that electricity of joy working with my students. So imagine my displeasure when my classroom felt like it was on fire many of those early years. And what I did, like I shared before, as a goal-oriented overachiever, I'm working on that, by the way, I was seeking out all the things, right? So all the Saturday workshops, courses, certifications, degrees, books, all the old school WebNX webinars, if any of you remember those things. All the things that I could do. I also was observing other teachers, people who were successful in doing what they were doing. Because I figured if I want to be a successful educator, then I should probably do what successful educators are doing. So I was even doing the exact same pieces. I saw them demonstrating in reading sessions and workshops. I was teaching the same lessons, like shot for shot, as I saw them demonstrating. And I was just trying to emulate and imitate as much as I could to just get my classroom to not be so on fire. But the more that I imitated and emulated other people, the more I realized I didn't really know exactly who I was as a teacher, what I believed in, what my values were. Remember those tough questions I was asking my students about how I could be better for them? Some of the feedback that they gave me, once we were more trusting in relationship with each other, was that they didn't really feel like they knew who I was. And that was interesting because I also was discovering that I didn't quite know. And they were trying to connect with me, but because I wasn't showing up as me, they were having a hard time. There was a disconnect. And so I realized I needed to kind of do some self-work and some examination of who I was, not my teacher mentor down the hall or that teacher I saw at that workshop, but who am I as a teacher? How am I going to show up in my classroom? What are my values, my beliefs? What do I stand for? And how are those pieces going to show up for my kids? And it was interesting. The more I stopped trying to be like all the other teachers, the more I was able to really stand up and say, no, this is what I believe as a teacher and how I'm going to teach. It really felt wonderful to start to connect with my students. That wall that was between us started to come down. But mostly when I think back on that period of time, I actually feel relief. I feel relief that me being authentically me, exactly who I am already naturally, was not only enough to be a good teacher, but it was what my students were desiring. They wanted me to show up fully as me, Miss Cuthbertson, not somebody else down the hall. And so really the first step towards a culturally responsive approach, it's not all the diverse repertoire, it's not the curriculum and the lessons, it's actually not any of that. It's the work that you do to understand who you are so that you can also understand how do those pieces show up in my instruction, because they are, whether you realize it or not. In fact, the work that I did on myself is still work that I do all of the time, and it shows up in all different areas of my life. But knowing that who I am is enough and being able to go back to that is a relief and brought me a lot of joy. It still does. And so if you're also doing some of that self-work to kind of understand, well, who am I and how does it appear, here's a couple of questions that you can consider. And if you're taking notes, you could write these down. The first is, who am I? Deliberately a wide open question. What has contributed to me being this way? All the pieces of your past, what has brought you to right there in this moment where you are. How do I see the world? How do I interpret it? How do I see what's happening around me? How do my biases affect my teaching choices? Because they do. We all have bias, right? It doesn't have to be a four-letter word so much. And then really importantly, what do I need to unlearn and disrupt within myself? Because we all have things that we need to unlearn and things that we need to disrupt. For me, it was letting my ego get in the way and not being able to really connect with my learners the way that they were desiring of me, because I thought I knew everything. I didn't. They had so much of the knowledge that I needed. And so I pose those same questions to you, but then also I want you to consider for a moment, how well do you actually know your cultural frames of reference? It's not just your race, by the way. Because before we can start to get into the cultural frames of reference of our learners, we have to know those things about ourselves. Too many of us often are jumping all the way to trying to figure it out about our kids when we haven't figured ourselves out. That's the first place. And then how do those things show up in your instruction? Do you know those places where they are showing up? Now let's pause for a minute and talk about this word culture. Often when we hear the word culture, whether we realize it or not, society uses the word culture as a stand-in for race and ethnicity. But culture is just the common values and beliefs of a group of people. And how they have those common values and beliefs is they have common knowledge, experiences that they share, and also interests. Race and ethnicity are a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. There's no such thing as teaching with neutrality because of exactly this, right? Everything you're thinking, doing, believing, even what brought you here this morning is because of your cultural frames of reference. So we have to understand that everything we're doing in our classrooms as the instructional leader in our music rooms is affected by all those things. The question is, are you aware of how those things are being affected? For me, the joy that I felt in really being able to lean into myself and then letting my kids kind of lean in allowed us to have a connection that I realized I was missing from all of the running around and teachers pay teaching and Googling that I was doing. For me, the joy of being able to show up authentically as me and knowing my kids wanted that changed everything. That was the first step, really, for me. So let's affirm that. You repeat after me. I do the work to understand my values and beliefs so I can show up fully for myself and my students. And you can take that affirmation with you if that helps. How many in here are reading like IEPs and 504 plans and things of your students? A few of us? Okay, awesome. So the work that I do now with my consulting company, that's one of the first questions I have to ask my teachers is, tell me about your students. So you tell me. Tell me about your students. Who are they? Just shout it out. Entertaining. Yeah. Energetic. Very brave. Very shy. Outspoken. Interesting. Funny. Angry. Dysregulated. Self-conscious. Smart. Talented. Creative. Ooh, you guys are good. Normally when I ask that question, I get a lot of like surface level information, like my students look like this, they do these, I mean, I got a little bit of that also, but you also went a little bit below the surface, which is really where we have to go. One of my favorite memories when I was in the classroom was with one of my groups of fourth graders, a day after one of my fifth grade classes that was off the chain. And as they were coming in the classroom, my fourth graders, I knew I needed a little bit of a break. And so I was working on showing up fully as myself, right? And so I said, hey, do you mind if we have a couple of minutes to listen to music so I can have a little bit of a break? Easygoing group of kids, of course, they were like, sure. In fact, they were actually suggesting different pieces that they wanted me to pull up on my computer and play through the speakers. And so while I was doing that and just letting myself kind of remove my crazy thoughts and like really focus on the students right in front of me, I was listening to their conversation because they weren't just suggesting songs to listen to, they also were telling about why they were picking those songs. And they had heard me say I needed a break, and I'm sure they saw on my face that I needed a break. And so they were sharing why the songs they were picking helped them to kind of relax, how those songs helped them to get through a tough moment. And it was a really beautiful conversation, but I also was like, okay, let's go on to our lesson. But they didn't want to. They wanted to keep having this conversation. They were really enjoying it. And so I decided to lean in and not lean out. And I thought, oh, well, we can kind of tie this into music, right? We can sing songs. They were mostly suggesting pop songs and other pieces that are actually really great for form and harmony. So on the spot, I thought, well, we can lean into that while we're having this really beautiful conversation. What I loved about the conversation with my students and that I realized in that moment and why it's such a powerful memory for me is that I realized that I knew a lot about my students, but I didn't really know their motivations. I didn't really know what they believed in or their values. I hadn't heard some of their stories. I hadn't heard some of their triggers. But in that conversation, I realized I was able to actually understand who they were. You see, culturally responsive teaching is not about knowing your students at the surface, the labels, right? It's actually about understanding. Because I can know your name and a few things about you, that feels nice, right, to be acknowledged in that way. But it's nothing like the relationship with someone who knows your story, who knows your triggers, who knows what has led you to be where you are right now. That's a very different kind of relationship. And I realized, for me, that was like the next place I needed to go. I was doing the self-work, I was leaning in, even when it felt uncomfortable. I was allowing my students to connect with me, and now I needed to connect back with them, but I had to go below this surface level knowledge. All right, as music teachers though, the big question is, well, how do I understand, not just know, when I have hundreds of students? Anybody else like me that usually had 400 to 500 students in a year? When we have limited time, right? That's always the big question is, well, how do I do that? Well, first of all, we don't want to throw them into the deep end. We want to ask super risky questions about their home life and their race and their ethnicity, because that's not how authentic relationships come about, right? Authentic relationships start slow, and then we build up from there. So when we think about culture again, right, not just our race, our values and our beliefs, culture has many layers. Have you seen the picture of like an iceberg depicting culture? Icebergs are not alive. Culture is living. So I actually like the picture of like a fruit tree, maybe an apple tree. And when we use the layers of culture, we can actually develop those authentic, trusting relationships that allow us to not just know students, but understand them. So we can think about the surface level or concrete level of culture. These are the easiest things to pick off the tree, right? Maybe even on the ground already to pick up. These are things you can see and hear. Visible, tangible, food, dress, celebrations. Your school's multicultural day is likely doing this, which is a great place to start, but again is at the surface. We don't know deeply what we need to know to really make the instruction be effective, at least not yet. When we go a little bit deeper, the behavioral level of culture, we want to understand behaviors. Why do our students behave the way they do? Positive and negative. Behavior is not always a negative thing, right? So here we want to understand communication, language and how it's used, family roles. We want to understand like what's behind why my students are doing the things that they're doing. So the conversations and the musical lessons and things that we're engaging them with have to allow us to answer those questions, not just about favorites and interests, because that's concrete surface, but how do I get to their behaviors? Why do they do that? And then likely in a single course or semester in a year, you might not get all the way to the deepest level, the symbolic layer, but we still want to endeavor to eventually get there with our students. That's where the real authentic trusting happens, right? Here, you can think of it as the trunk and the roots of the tree, right? Literally holding everything else up, but some of it is not even visible, right? The roots of the tree, and never will be if the tree is alive, right? So here we want to understand worldview, religion. We really want to understand their values, and so the questions we ask them and the musical learning we engage them with has to allow us to be able to answer those kinds of questions. Being able to really connect with my students, and in that day with my fourth graders, I realized that that was going to be my next step, right? The ability for me to understand really their motivations to allow me to tailor the instruction exactly for them. Not only was it allowing me to tailor the instruction, but the learning environment as well, right? The brain tells us that we need to be able to feel not just safe, but also brave to be able to take the risks necessary for the deeper, more inquiry-based learning. So if we want our students to learn at a deeper level, retain information, we have to actually create belonging and affirmation, not just safety. You know what I mean? Because you can feel safe, but that doesn't mean that you feel brave enough to speak up when you feel like something is going wrong, or feel brave enough to say something and your teacher will actually do what you have suggested. So let's affirm that. Repeat after me. I invest in the success, of my students by authentically connecting with them and understanding who they are beyond the labels. Because the labels are a helpful place to start, right? Concrete, but they don't tell us the behaviors and they don't tell us the true values and the beliefs. That's when you really get to know somebody. Now, how many of you in here know that music education can truly change lives? Of course, I'm asking music people at a music educators conference, right? Literally preaching to the choir. What I love, though, about music, when I think about my own journey, my own story, I know that everything that has led me to be the successful person that stands here today, I learned in a music class. I mean, think about it. The skills it takes to enter into a music competition, right, which I did many along my way of thinking I was going to be a principal flutist, but entering into the competition, applying by the deadline, preparing the music, showing up on time, and doing it, that's project management skills. The skills to be able to take a tough passage and a piece of music, break it down into its parts, and massage each until it's smooth, that's discipline. The skills to work with an ensemble to prepare for a concert, right? So line up all the parts and balance them, that's collaboration skills. And I know all of you know that, but I also know that music teachers, we get so excited. Remember me at the beginning of my journey? I was so excited to teach all the things I forgot about the most important, the connection. Not only did I forget about that, maybe I didn't know it at that time, but I also was so focused on the notes and the skills and the techniques that I missed that actually the reason that music can change lives has nothing to do with the notes on the page. It's everything about who our learners become because they're engaging in music. I learned that lesson for the first time with one of my second graders who then became a third grader with me. In second grade, she was a bright, shining star. She was inquisitive, curious, excited to learn. Summer happened, she came back in third grade, and then suddenly she became combative, aggressive, and disruptive in my music lessons. And I wanted to understand what this change in personality was due to, so I went to her third grade teacher and I asked, like, hey, what's up? And our third grade teacher shared with me that there had been some big changes. Her older sister had been expelled from our school. Her dad's girlfriend had just had a new baby. And so at home, she was not getting that kind of attention that she was desperately seeking. And so what was happening in school was she was seeking it in all the negative ways that she could. But I remembered that bright, shining star. And so I thought, I remember in second grade, she always seemed to be interested whenever I would pull out the piano or our small keyboard sometimes for our lessons. And I thought, well, what if I use what I know I have got, music, to connect with her? And so I invited her to have piano lessons with me just once or twice a week at the end of our school day. We had a little bit of extra time before dismissal. And she agreed. And so we started having lessons together. And it was interesting because I knew that I wanted an opportunity to connect more deeply with her, but she also had the opportunity to get the kind of one-on-one attention that she desperately needed. I wish I could have done this for every one of my students that were just like her. And as our lessons progressed and she got stronger, we were able to do more challenging pieces, she still had this kind of chip on her shoulder that she was too cool for school. But in our one-on-one time, that wall started to come down. And I started to see not only that shining star come back, but I started to see her confidence come back. If I had focused on her misbehavior in my classroom and trying to fix her, I would have missed a really important opportunity to what I hope made a difference for her. I know it made a difference for me to be able to put my ego aside about how she was disrupting lessons to really focus on this human who clearly needed something. Like I said earlier, teaching music, it's not about teaching music. It's actually about who our learners become because they're engaging in a process that engages their minds, their hearts, right? With my students, I remember thinking when we were working on Fur Elise, that Beethoven piece, and I remember when she finally nailed that opening passage, I remember seeing her face just light up, but then immediately she went like that because she didn't want me to see her smiling. But I also remember thinking to myself, like, she's gonna take this confidence into every other area of her life. That's really the power of music, but we don't get that when we focus on our choirs performing perfectly, right? Them getting all the notes right. And so when we think about culturally responsive teaching, the biggest misconception that I continue to work to break with music educators, but even folks who are not in music education, other teachers, just other people, we've got to break this conception that it's all about diversifying our repertoire and repertoire diversity. Because I could diversify my repertoire. We could have been doing diverse things, my student and I, but it's not about the repertoire. It's about how do I understand this learner enough to be able to create effective instruction for them. That's what culturally responsive teaching is. Specifically, though, when it comes to music, that's the work that I do, music and arts, I define culturally responsive music education as leveraging the prior knowledge, experiences, and interests of our young musicians. Remember, I said that's their cultural frames of reference, right? It's not about their race. but using that to be able to work in partnership with them, to then engage them in relevant real-world context of music making that help them to understand themselves, others, and also the world around them. And lucky for us, we get to do it through the medium of music. Isn't that wonderful? But we have to think about music as a vehicle instead of music as just the notes and the techniques. And so I thought maybe we can talk a little bit more about a specific example, because I talked about how we have to do the self-work, right, to get our ego out of the way, our biases out of the way so we can connect. We talked about how we can use the layers of culture to develop those trusting relationships. But then always the question my teachers ask me is, so what does this look like in a rehearsal, Ashley? How do I do this in a lesson? What does the curriculum look like? So can we do a quick example? I have an idea of a little song that I think maybe some people in this room know. Does anyone know the little folk tune, Hot Cross Buns? Okay, I figured in a room of music teachers, we probably know that. So when you think about hot cross buns, maybe you teach it or use it for things that I remember I did. So teaching rhythm, melody. My beginning band students, it was in our technique book for learning new fingerings and things. But tell me, what kind of song actually is hot cross buns? Shout it out to me. A folk song. What kind of classification of folk song? Does anyone know? Like, what is it used for? Mm-hmm.
Teaching the basics of when you're just learning basic theory, how do I go from 3 to 2 to 1, and then form from A to B.
Yeah, the basics, yes. But what about the actual tune, Hot Cross Buns? Does anyone know what it actually is used for?
Selling.
For selling, yes. Marketing, advertisement, right? Promotional kinds of things. Do you think your students have some experience with marketing or advertising, maybe in their phone or in their email? Every day I have somebody trying to, I was just telling somebody earlier, I have my favorite friend who calls me every day is spam likely, because somebody's always calling me all the time trying to sell me something, right? So now, instead of focusing on all those basic techniques, what if we use hot cross buns to connect to something that probably our students have in their frame of reference, which even the youngest students have experienced seeing ads, right? We're bombarded with marketing messages all of the time. Does anybody else know also, like, specifically, when, culturally, when did hot cross buns, like, become something that would be used? I'm trying not to give too much away. Does anyone know, like, culturally, what actually that song is for? Yes, for Good Friday. Yeah, so for a cultural celebration. So let's use that, right? Advertisements, the actual purpose of why that song came about. Today we hear like jingles, right, would be the kind of way that we do. Specifically, hot cross buns is a street cry. So think of at a basketball game, people going up and down the bleachers shouting, I have this to sell, right? That's the kind of thing that's happening, because that's also advertisement, right? If we think about the full artistic process, so connecting, creating, performing, responding, and we think about the principles of culturally relevant pedagogy, now we can create a more deeper learning experience, right, and have a little bit more fun. So what if we think about the connection piece? Well, connecting to the actual purpose of hot cross buns, which is literally a pastry, a bakery good that's used and baked during Good Friday as part of those celebrations. Well, now it becomes a window and a mirror, doesn't it? For students who celebrate that, Catholics, right, who celebrate that, but also for our students who need to learn about other people different from them. And even if they don't celebrate Good Friday or Easter, now we can have a discussion about, well, what are different things that are present during celebrations that you and your family partake in? What kind of food might you see? What kind of music might you sing or hear? That's cultural competence, right? The ability to understand other people and as well as yourself. Sometimes we miss that. Cultural competence is also for you too. We also can connect to literally how advertising is being used through that song. So if I'm trying to promote my products, I'm not gonna whisper it, right? I'm gonna shout it out. And now we have a reason to talk about music expression, dynamics, right? And specifically, now we can introduce terms like piano, mezzo forte, forte, and things like that. And now, because we're talking about the expression, maybe we want to actually perform it, right? So now we have a reason to learn the basics, the melodic concepts, the rhythm concepts, the form of the piece. Now I've given my students a chunky, deep thing to really get into. Connecting, responding, performing. What about creating? Well, there really are people who make a lot of money, actually, creating jingles. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. I could go anywhere in the world, right? And I could do that, and I have actually, around the country, I should say, and everybody knows that piece, right? That's actually a real career. So now can we my students, step into the role of a jingle writer, and can we write our own jingles to promote a product or something that they care about, but they have to use what? The musical elements. They have to use those things we learned, the rhythm, the melody, the expression. Now we've given them a worthwhile reason to do those things. Also, when you think about like the order of learning, the highest form of understanding is creation. So if they're able to create with those elements and those pieces, now we have powerful data about how well they were able to understand. So we had performing, connecting, performing, responding, creating. What about social political consciousness? Oh, we did cultural competence, right? Social politically, we can talk about marketing as an industry. Why is it that certain companies get their products, their services advertised, but then other companies have a hard time sharing that airtime? And why is it that some communities are more susceptible to things like fake news and negative persuasive tactics than other communities? That's a social political conversation that Hot Cross Buns has now opened for us. It's way more than diversity, right? I don't think anybody would argue that Hot Cross Buns is not a diverse piece, right? Remember what I said, it's not about diversity. How can I use what my students have in their cultural frames of reference, in this case, marketing, to make an effective learning experience? And in this case, how can we use an inquiry-based way to learn about it as well? Way more than just, let me, on my flute, learn how to play, I don't know, FED or something. That's probably the wrong key. So when we think about culturally responsive teaching, when we are able to create these joyful learning experiences, because I think that was more joyful when I did that with my students, usually my 3rd and 4th graders, than when I was just teaching the notes, right? I think that joyful experience comes from they were developing skills way beyond my 4 walls of my classroom. They were learning skills for life, right? To be able to work with other people, to understand them, and also to understand the world around them. And so let's affirm that, right? Repeat after me. I look deeply into the music to find relevant, joyful learning experiences that build important skills for all my students. For all of our students, not just the ones who are going to get it first right away, right? How can I connect with something they already understand to make this abstract thing, which music is, more effective for them? Realizing that I didn't have to chase after that electric feeling, it actually changed my whole life, not just my teacher self, but also me as a person. I am different because I leaned into my students and leaned into learning who they were to create effective instruction than I ever would have if I had just continued to do it the way I thought it needed to be done. And it's interesting that now that I get to do this work with teachers all over the place, the same things I'm finding with the teachers that I support. It's not about thinking that we have to do it in a certain way. It's about how do we connect with the learners directly in front of us. Because what I know is that the more we work together to shift things away from how it's always been done, to really centering this approach that centers really the humanity and the brilliance of our learners, that's actually how we make equitable access for all kids. Because you can have a course at your school, but if kids don't see how they belong in that choir, they don't see how it matters to their life, that's actually not access. It's not equitable access. The work that I do to shift the trajectory of what we do in our field really comes back to these lessons that I learned over my 12 years in the classroom. How can I slow what I'm doing down to look deeply and to be able to connect? Because for me, when I stopped trying to imitate all those wonderful teachers and just allowed myself to learn who I was, I could show up authentically as me. Not only did my students want that, they desired it, and it allowed us to connect a lot better. When I stopped focusing on the labels of all my students and really sought to understand who they were and work with them to create a learning environment that we all were excited to engage in, it changed the way I even relate to adults to this day. And when I stopped focusing on getting the notes right and really sought to use music as a vehicle to develop skills for in my music classroom, but also way beyond that, that's where I really was able to know the power that music can have in our lives and in the lives of our children. I know that music can change the world because I've seen it happen in my classroom and the classrooms of the teachers that I have the privilege to be able to support. And so when I think about my time in the classroom and my time now, I remember still my early years in the classroom. Those are pictures from all kinds of different periods of my teaching career. But I still remember that first year, May 2010, fall 2010, chasing that joy, but realizing I didn't have to chase it, right? It was always there if I just would slow down and lean in to myself, my students, so that we could find it. And so I'll leave that last question with you. What are some ways that you can slow down a little bit so that you can stop chasing the joy, lean in, connect with the folks that you get to serve, so that you can find it, not only for yourself, but for also the students and the adult learners maybe that you work with. My name is Ashley Cuthbertson. It has been an absolute joy for me to get to share a little bit of my story with you, and I hope that the lessons that I shared, some good and some a little bit tricky, right? I hope all of those were helpful for you as you continue to think about how as music educators we can continue to bring that joy to the lives of our students, but also to us, because if we don't have joy first, we can't give it to our kids. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. Before I let you go, I actually have 2 quick favors. Is that okay if I ask that of you? So the first is, I hope you will come visit me in Hartkey, I think is how it's said, because I'll be over there the next couple of days. I would love to hear more about your takeaways, what you're doing in your classrooms, ways that you're centering joy for yourself. Can a few of you do that for me? And the second thing is, the only reason that I'm able to stand up here and share about my story and also share the very real practical strategies that I know works, that I've seen it, is because I'm still doing those things I was doing way back in 2000, maybe 11 and 12, asking my students the tough questions. So can I ask you a couple of tough questions too? The only reason I'm able to do this work is because I'm still seeking feedback from those that I serve. They're just older now. So if you could scan this QR code, it's a super quick survey, I promise. I would love to know what resonated with you, what didn't resonate with you, and don't be shy, because that's the only reason that I'm able to continue to do this work, just like I was in the classroom, right? I had to lean into hearing that feedback. And if that QR code doesn't work, there's a bit.ly link there as well. So I'm gonna pause for a moment so you have a chance to share that. And then while we're kind of paused, if anyone has any quick questions while we're all here together, I'd love to answer a couple of questions if you have. I know I gave you a lot to think about though, so if you want to process and then come see me later, that's cool too.
In those moments when your class was on fire, what was going on with you in depth of that as you were navigating being the goal-oriented, perfectionist person? You didn't use that word.
But I was struggling to recover from perfectionism as well, yeah.
So I resonated with that.
Yeah.
As you were navigating that, what other things were going on with you in depth? Because you had a joy for music, but the fire was ablaze.
Yeah, it was ablaze. I think what was the biggest thing that was happening was me really questioning if I made the right decision to go into education after all. I remember many times, I was still gigging a lot during that time. I remember thinking like, maybe I should just continue to do that and not do the teaching. But I think ironically, my perfectionism and my like almost insatiable need to like get it right is what kept me in the classroom, because I didn't want to not reach the goal I had set. So I think ironically, even though I struggled and it felt like maybe I shouldn't have made that choice, I think ironically, me being so goal-oriented and being like, I'm not gonna stop until I get it, I think that's what kept me in the classroom, because it kept me trying and experimenting until I figured it out. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for allowing me to spread a little bit of my message with you. I hope to see you over at Hartkey and throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you again. Feel free to stay in touch with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. And feel free to ask any other questions as well. Thank you so much.